Next Monday, evenings are going to take a trip from Adelaide to Darwin for a week of NT-based shenanigans. And in honour of that journey, we thought we'd take a look at the history of the train that's made that same journey since 1929, the Ghan. John Wilson has written multiple books on the subject and is here to tell us some yarns about the Ghan. G'day, John. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, Jason. It's the Ghan.
That was my first thing. So I'm from Adelaide, so I'm saying Ghan like dance and prance, but it's actually the Ghan.
Yes.
Okay. Where are you from, John?
I'm from Adelaide.
You're from Adelaide, so okay. So that's, even with your Adelaide upbringing, it's still the Ghan.
Yes.
Okay. Right. Well, my first question was a mistake. So when was the last time you took a trip on the Ghan?
I took a trip on the Ghan. It had been shut down for 5 months because of the COVID. We rode it on the very first trip that it did after the COVID, and we went to Darwin and we came back again. And it was half full, and it was good because we didn't have to fight around the crowds, and we got to speak to a few people, and it was a good trip.
Okay, nice. Well, it sounds like you've taken a lot of trips over the journey. Do you know how many you've taken?
I've only done the one return trip.
Oh, okay, great. Excellent. Is it usually full to the brim and you can't really move around too much?
Yes, it is. Got to book months ahead these days. They usually combine it now with a cruise or a resort, and it's a whole holiday package. So you're pretty lucky to get a trip to do Darwin and then come back again on the same return.
Yeah, okay. And so is that when your fascination started with the Ghan, or was it...
No, I've been a train enthusiast for many years, and I've been writing books over the last 6 or 7 years. And in 2000, I wrote the Overland, a social history, and then in the next year I did the Ghan, and I called it The Train to Urdnawup, a social history of the Afghan Express. That's where I got my expertise from, I guess. And more recently, I've done a book called The Break of Gauge, a social history, which examines the history of Australia's break of gauge and how it happened and how we haven't been able to fix it.
Yeah, I definitely do want to get into that. So, first of all, what is the Ghan? Is it the track? Is it the journey? Is it the engine, the carriages? What is the thing that makes the Ghan?
Well, I think it's all of the above.
Because at certain points there have been two running, right?
I'll tell you the story.
Okay.
In 1891, the railhead from Adelaide reached Urdnadatta. Now, South Australia had a dream of building a railway from the bottom of Australia to the top of Australia, and that was the Great North-South Transcontinental Railway. But by the time they got to Urdnadatta, they realised they couldn't afford it. Stuck there. Now, it would have been an impossible railway to operate, because if they'd built the line further north, they'd have to get coal and water up to it. And I did an exercise with some rail people a few years ago, and we worked out that you could get to Barrow Creek by putting coal, sending trains up with coal and stockpiling it there. But you couldn't get any further than Barrow Creek because they'd run out of coal. They couldn't get back again. So it would have been an impossible railway to operate with steam. There's also the problem of the track maintenance, because they would have had to have track crews every 20 miles with their families and their schools and all the logistics that went with it.
Mm.
The thing is that they didn't know which way they were going. They got to Marie or Hergot Springs in 1884, and they didn't know whether they were going to go up the west of Lake Eyre or the east of Lake Eyre. And so then they followed the telegraph. And that was a bad move, because they'd hoped that the pastoralists would basically pay for this railway by sending their stock down. But the pastoralists didn't send any stock down. And so they realised that they were running at a whopping loss. Now, that was at the southern end. Now, at the northern end, in 1889, they started building from Palmerston southwards. Palmerston is what we now call Darwin, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a tremendous losing proposition. And by the time of Federation, South Australia was just about broke by running this railway. And they tried to offload it to the Commonwealth, and they did eventually, but there were people in South Australia who wouldn't let go of it. And there was an agreement initially that it would be done within a particular time frame, but that was changed. Alfred Deakin, he was a smart lawyer and barrister, but he was a smart Prime Minister, and he got a deal with Tom Price, who was the South Australian Premier, that it would be done in reasonable time. Now, in subsequent years, this was challenged in the High Court, and it was found to be invalid. But the railway has gone through to Darwin in 2004. This has happened because I've got concrete sleepers, continuous welded rail track, and diesel electric locomotives that can go to Darwin and back without a hitch.
Right,
So,
2004. I can't believe it took that long.
yes, well, they couldn't have done it any earlier because they didn't have the quality of diesel electrics, and it was only in about the 1980s that concrete sleepers became the norm.
Right. Yeah, everything I read about the Ghan mentions it was very unreliable as a service. Sometimes passengers had to repair the tracks. Is
Yes.
that right? Right.
Well, it started life as the Udnadata Express, which was a misnomer because it took 3 days to get from Adelaide to Udnadata.
Right.
And this would happen because you'd have to sleep overnight in the hotel at Quorn and then at Maree. And you only travel during the day. Now, in 1923, W.A. Webb, who was the Chief Commissioner of the South Australian Railways, introduced a sleeping car. And this reduced the time down to 2 days. Now, this was quite a thing for the northern districts of South Australia. And on the day that the sleeping car was put on the Udnadata Express, the railway workers stood around at Quorn to see who was going to travel on this new sleeping car. And there was one solitary Afghan. Now, we've got to remember that the Afghans at this stage were second-class citizens, and they'd been banned from travelling on the Trans-Australian Railway. So that it would have been a bit of a turnaround if they'd honoured the Afghans by naming the train after them.
Yeah.
But there was one chap in this crowd who stood around and said, "Struth, if that's all that's travelling on the train, we'll have to call it the Afghan Express."
Right.
And that was on the 30th of August 1923. Now, that chap was Ernie Smith. And a few years ago, we tracked down the family of Ernie Smith, and they hadn't known that he'd named the Ghan, because the Ghan was named, it was a contraction of the Afghan Express.
Mm.
And his great-grandson is Mark Butler, the member for Hindmarsh and our Minister of Health.
Wow.
And Mark didn't know that his great-grandfather had been the man who'd named the Afghan Express.
That's incredible. Okay.
Yes, well, the track that they built up to from Udnadata to Alice Springs, they built in 1929, and it was done with minimum cost. And it went through creek beds and it was continually washed out. And it was not until the 1960s that Keith Smith, who was Commissioner of the Commonwealth Railways, declared that we've just got to build a decent railway to Alice Springs. And that's where they got the railway from Tarcoola to Alice Springs, which was one of the most remarkable railway construction jobs in the world. And it was done under budget, and it was done a year earlier than was planned.
Wow, that never happens.
Malcolm Fraser was keen to put it through to Darwin as soon as they got to Alice Springs. But there was a change of government, and Bob Hawke, while he said he was going to build the railway to Darwin, reneged on it, and it was another 10 years before they got stuck into it and got the railway through to Darwin.
Okay. Now, in railway terms, what is a gauge and why is that important to the story of the Ghan?
Gauge is the distance between the rails. In Australia, we've got 3 main gauges. We've got the broad gauge, which is the Irish gauge, which is the Adelaide suburban system, and the Melbourne interurban system. We've got the standard gauge, which is the New South Wales gauge, which is also on the Trans-Australian Railway and the line to Darwin. And we've got the narrow gauge, which is 3'6" or 106.7 millimetres. You can't run a train on a different gauge. It's whatever gauge you choose, you're stuck with.
Mm.
Now, I want to tell you about the first train to Alice Springs, we'll call it. It wasn't called the Ghan then, and it saved lives. And it was interesting that when this first train went to Alice Springs in 1929, there was a telegraph operator from Barrow Creek who was brought down to Alice Springs because he had appendicitis. There were 2 doctors on that first train to Alice Springs. One was Len Pellew, who's one of the noted surgeons in Adelaide, and Dr. Fry. And when the train got to Alice Springs, they did an appendicectomy on him within the hour. And that was one life saved, but there were many more lives saved because there'd been a lot of scurvy in the native population. And there'd been dozens of children die of scurvy because the camel trains that went out of Udnadata could only carry salt, sugar, flour, and no perishables.
Mm.
And there was a chap called Puggaree Jack. There was a university group went up on this first train, and they wanted to hear Puggaree Jack singing because he'd been noted on a previous exercise as being one of the great singers in the Hermannsburg mission. But they got there and he died of scurvy 2 weeks before the train arrived. I'm going to read this out. The pastor had gone to pray with him and was doing so in the language of the Arunta tribe. Huggery Jack turned to him and said, "You praying pigeon, then I get better. Big fella God, no been hear him Arunta word."
Wow. Okay. And so did that mean that from then on they started bringing up more fresh produce?
Yes, there was the group that went up on the very first train to Alice Springs had a consignment of oranges. And they got out to the Hermansburg mission and they distributed the oranges. And there was a remarkable recovery. But before this, there'd been dozens of native population who died of scurvy because of the fact that they couldn't get fresh produce up to them. So I think that's one of the unsung great things about that railway is that it saved lives.
Yeah, fantastic. You've said that because of all the delays in the Ghan being completed, it's slowed Australia's economic development. What do you mean by that?
Well, Central Australia could not have developed without the railway. And it's interesting that we've got a tremendous tourism business up there. Now, that tourism industry was spearheaded by Harold Clapp, who was the commissioner of the Victorian Railways. And he had what he called reso trains, which went to various destinations to promote the tourism. And he ran the first tourist exercise to Central Australia. And what they did is they had about 20 Model T Fords and they put them on the train and took them up to Alice Springs and they toured around in these Model T Fords. And they didn't even have petrol stations up there then.
Wow. And so they just would go around as a tourism exercise?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Any other fun facts about the Ghan?
I think the interesting thing about the Ghan is that the present operators do not acknowledge the story about Ernie Smith calling it the Ghan.
Yeah.
Now, they've obviously got their reasons, but we've researched this very deeply, and they have said that it was named the Ghan out of respect for the Afghan Cameleers in 1929 when the first train went through to Alice Springs. There was no ceremony attached to that first train, and there's no contemporary evidence that them officially calling it the Ghan. But there is evidence that in 1924 there was an article in the South Australian Register which said that the locals call it the Afghan Express.
Mm.
So I think that the evidence is very much there. And there was a chap called George Williams who was an engine driver and locomotive inspector in Port Augusta and Quorn. And he was actually on duty the night that Ernie Smith said we'll have to call it the Afghan Express. And he subsequently wrote many stories and punched them out on his clunky old typewriter. But the Commonwealth Railways who he worked for didn't like it because they'd cooked up this story about the Ghan being named in honour of the Afghan Cameleers in 1929. And they threatened him with dismissal.
Right.
And that's the reason why I did the book about the train to Erdna Whoop Whoop, because many years ago I'd quoted this Commonwealth Railways story and I got a letter from George Williams which told me the story according to him, which I've subsequently found to be totally correct. But I felt guilty that I'd never done anything. It was many years since I saw when I had this letter from George Williams, and he's long passed on, but I felt that it needed to be recorded for his memory, that he was the one person who was prepared to stand up and shout out the true facts of history.
Yeah, well, at some point, it may become the recognised story. Thank you so much for telling us a little bit about the history of the Ghan, John, and correcting my pronunciation.
Okay, thank you, Jason.
There you go. John Wilson there, author of a couple of books about the Ghan. If you want to find out what they are and maybe pick up a copy, sarlinesbooks.com.au. So sarlinesbooks.com.au. It's John Wilson there.